This video is on how to solve a factorized quadratic equation. So this is actually the first of our videos on quadratic equations. So I think it probably is important to talk about what a quadratic equation actually looks like. You should know that a quadratic expression, so an algebraic expression, would be one where the degree is at most 2, and it could have 3 terms. It could have just 2 terms. Or it even could have just 1 term. Okay, now if I talk about a quadratic equation, then straight away I need to have an equal sign, and usually it would be equals to 0, but it doesn't have to be. I could, if I wanted to, make it equal to 7, but for the most part you will find you get all your terms on one side equal to 0. But these are all now quadratic equations, and when we have a quadratic expression, if we have an expression, then with an expression, that is something that you can be asked to simplify. It may not simplify, but if you're asked to simplify, it will, and that's something you can do with an expression. But if we give you an equation, then what we will be asking you to do is solve. Okay, and they are two very different things. You can't solve an expression, you can only solve an equation, and you can simplify an equation, but really the end goal is to solve for the unknown pronumeral. So in these cases, I would be wanting to find out what does this x equal, so that I can if I substitute the x value back in, this entire expression should be equal to 0. That's what I'm trying to find. What value of x will give me 0, or in this case, what value of x, if I substitute it in here, will give me 7. So you are actually solving to find the value of the pronumeral. So it's very important you get, that's what you're doing with an equation. Now this video, however, is just on factorized quadratic equations. So these equations will already be in factored form with brackets. Now, in order to solve a quadratic equation, you need to know this null law factor, and it's quite a bit of common sense, so hopefully it clicks in your head. And it just says that if we know that a times b, let's say a and b are two numbers, and they multiply to give 0, then either a, what do we know about a or b if the product of a and b is 0? Think about what you know when we multiply. How do we end up with 0? So if you think about just multiplying numbers, 5 3s are 15, 2 times minus 4, that's minus 8, 6 times 10 is 60. None of those products give me 0. What do I have to have in my product to end up with a 0? And hopefully you realize that if you're going to end up with a product resulting in 0, then one of those two numbers has to be 0. It might be that number, it might be this number, but one or both of them. So A could equal 0, or B could equal 0, or they could both equal 0, is what you need to be able to conclude. And we're going to use that null law factor when we solve these quadratic equations. So before we get started, how do I know this is a quadratic equation? Well, we've done a lot of expanding brackets, and if you multiply this out, you're going to get y squared minus 5y, and that is definitely a quadratic equation. But we don't want to do that. When you get an equation in factored form, that's ideal, because that's actually the form we usually want a quadratic equation to be in, so that we can solve. So how are we going to use this null law factor? Well, what this says is y, don't forget y represents some number. Y, when it's multiplied by y minus 5, we're going to get 0. And so the null law factor says if we're going to multiply y by y minus 5 and we get 0, well then y would, in order for this to happen, y would have to be 0, or y minus 5 could be 0. And so when we get those two expressions, we're able to solve and say, well, if y minus 5 equals 0, then y would have to be 5, or y would equal 0. So we're actually going to get two possible values that satisfy this equation. And if I take those values and substitute them back in, I can see they work. If I let this y be 0, then the whole of the left-hand side will become 0 through that product. And if I let this y over here be 5, well, 5 minus 5 is nothing, and then that will result in the whole of the left-hand side giving me 0, which is exactly what I'm supposed to get. So the null law factor is just saying that if I have any two numbers that are multiplied to give 0, the only way that can happen is if one of the numbers equals 0, or both of them equal 0. So I can find the values of x, which will give me that 0. And so this tells me that if x is 3, which I can just see straight away here, if x is 3, that whole bracket will become 0, and then the whole of the left-hand product will become 0. Or maybe x could be minus 7. So if I put in minus 7, and check it out over here, minus 7 plus 7 is 0, and yes, that whole product on the left-hand side will become 0, which means the equation would be satisfied. So with these quadratic equations, you will get two solutions. There are some equations where you'll get one, but that's only because the bracket is repeated twice. So for example, y minus 4 equals 0. You can get y equals 4, and then y equals 4 again, because the brackets are the same. So let's have a look at just a slightly harder version, but it's the exact same idea. We've got two brackets multiplied to give 0. So the null law factor says that the only way we're going to get a 0 is if this bracket, or this number, 4m minus 3, could equal 0, or 2m plus 5 could also equal 0. So when I solve those, they're slightly harder to solve, but really it's the same exact idea. I just will get a fraction or a decimal, okay? And this says that if m is 3/4, then I will get a 0. And then also, the other possibility is that 2m plus 5 could equal 0. And we get 2n, that means 2m equals minus 5, and m equals minus 5 on 2. And just to check it so you can see that it works, if I do let m be 3/4, if I put a 3/4 there, hopefully your fraction work is okay. 4 times 3/4, well that gives me, if the 4's cancel, that gives me 3 minus 3, and that's 0. And as soon as this bracket's 0, the entire left-hand side product will be 0, which gives me the 0 on the right-hand side. And the same will happen here with minus 5 on 2. So if I let m be minus 5 on 2, when I multiply that, the 2 in the numerator and the 2 in the denominator will cancel to give 1, and then I'll get minus 5 plus 5, which is in fact 0, and that whole left-hand product then will become 0, which will satisfy the equation. So I hope this makes sense, how to solve a quadratic equation that is already in factored form. There's no need to expand the brackets and go backwards. Really what we want to do is use this null law factor, which says that if I've got a product that results in 0, then one of those two numbers or both would have to be 0 in order to get the 0.